Welcome to our third program, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the three sponsors of this series. I moved the poster so more people can see it on this side, but we are sponsored by the American Association of University Women, the League of Women Voters of Tyler Smith County, and the Public Library. And these organizations have contributed toward bringing down the price on the Great Decisions book. The price is down to $25. It would have been higher, but for these organizations. There are only 5 books left, and if you're interested, then you can purchase them at the information desk in the library. We have sign-up sheets out there for you to sign up to receive a weekly reminder. Hopefully you are receiving those weekly reminders, but if you're not, and if you signed up, then we were confused about your email address. So you might want to give it another try, and we'll hopefully interpret it a little better this second time. I think it's appropriate to say thank you to Mary Barnhart, who has provided the goodies over here. She drives all the way from Palestine, which is quite a drive. She even came last week when the weather was terrible. And she does this in a loving contribution to Great Decisions, and she's actually excited about coming each week, and we thank Mary. While I'm thinking of it, everybody needs to silence their cell phones. We certainly don't want to disturb our speaker as she is presenting in a few minutes. As a reminder, Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on world affairs. The 8 topics that we are covering this year are considered the 8 most critical issues facing America. And I might add at this point that those of you who have purchased a book have surely realized by now that the 8 topics are rearranged in the book. Actually, we did the rearranging with our topics because we needed to accommodate our speaker's schedule. So just check the schedule as to what topic is next week and then go to that section in the book. In fact, the topics are so specific this year that many qualified speakers just didn't want to tackle them. After I found a speaker for this topic, climate change in the global order, and had already received his bio and his photo, he gave me a call one day and he said, you know, I'd really like to do this topic, but I know of someone who will do you a much better job than I would. And besides that, she is an excellent speaker. And he recommended Dr. Ott. So I went to the web and I looked up Dr. Ott, and when I read her qualifications, I thought, yippee, this is the perfect person to cover this topic. So let me quickly summarize a few points from your handout. Dr. Ott is a biology teacher at Tyler Junior College and has been teaching biology there since 1982. She earned her doctoral degree, and I find this very fascinating, her doctoral degree in forestry from Stephen F. Austin State University with a research area of biodiversity and plantation understory. In 2004, Dr. Ott was elected president of the National Association of Biology Teachers. And then in 2016, she was given the honorary membership award for the National Association of Biology Teachers. Outside of teaching, Dr. Ott's interests include keeping up with environmental issues such as biodiversity, conservation, and climate change. She's also studies the intersection of science and society, mechanisms of evolution, and science education. So we are in for a real treat today. Let's welcome Dr. Betsy Ott.
Now I'm intimidated by my own introduction. Have to see if I can live up to the way it's titled. So thank you all for having me. I do want to acknowledge. Can't hear.
You're going to have to hold it on your chin.
Yeah, right like that. Can you hear now?
No. A little higher.
No. So we can hear you, but not. Can you hear it now?
No.
Tilting it. Is it better now? So is it good now?
No.
So we can all enjoy the animation while we're waiting for the battery or the microphone. Yes. Can you hear me well enough or not even?
You project,
So we'll
yes.
I'm trying to use my teacher voice.
Yeah.
Yes. But I wear out really quick when I have to do that. That's the microphone. Plus, I understand some people's hearing is not what it used to be by mine. So I always use a microphone when asked to do so. And as soon as we get a new battery, we'll be moving on with that. So we'll just take our time and wait. Just a little bit about me while we're waiting, so that it's not that crucial. My husband, who's in the audience, you didn't know I was going to do that to you. My husband's recently retired from Parks and Wildlife. He was on the fisheries crew. You might have seen him on TV being interviewed about, bleaches in Lake Tyler, or much better now. Randy, you're so powerful you didn't realize.
There we go.
I'm sure that's what it is. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. K, but I didn't see him come in the room. We talked briefly. He asked if I knew any ecologists. I'm like, so he asked me to give this talk in his stead because as he got into the topic, having already committed, he realized how overwhelming it is. So there's simply no way in 30 minutes or 40 minutes for us to cover the gamut of issues associated with climate change. I have 3 simple ideas I'm going to present, and then I'm trying to save enough time at the end for questions if you have them. So we're going to be talking about what's happening right now in the world. We're beyond the point where climate scientists have been predicting change. We're living the change. So we'll be talking about that. Most of you are aware of what's going on right now, but we'll kind of get some issues. And then how did we get here? That is what happened to make climate change occur, and then hopefully what we can do next. So in terms of what's happening now, probably the biggest thing in the news has been the fires in Australia. I looked at pictures and they were all just too depressing to me. So I've got a few images, but I just couldn't do the images of Australia. And I was looking for something that would convey the impact of those fires in Australia without showing horrific pictures. 10.65 million hectares have been burned, 3,000 houses destroyed. The area in Australia that's been affected is equal to the size of Kentucky or Tennessee in terms of the time. Imagine losing the entire state of Tennessee to fire. That's the impact of the fires in Australia. Here in this country, we've certainly suffered from droughts in the Pacific Northwest. We've had fires repeatedly. I have friends in Oregon. The kids were not allowed to go out to recess because the air was so full of ash and soot. It was not safe to go outdoors. And that is just, that's just the last 2 years. The Camp Fire was devastating. There were parts of California that burned that just in general don't burn. And obviously there are complex issues, like there are more people there now. They're moving into areas that people did not used to occupy. So part of the issue there is people are living in areas where probably they shouldn't be in terms of the ecology of the area. area, but definitely the prolonged droughts in the Pacific Northwest have increased the severity of the fires in that area. So worldwide, 19% of cities with more than 1 million habitats are already in areas subject to drought. And that's about 370 million people just currently being affected. So you can get some idea by the darker colors of where in the world we're looking at, where drought is more severe than it has been in the past. On another front, if you look at water and wind, floods in the U.S., what happened in 2009 to the planting season in the Corn Belt, the U.S., it was underwater for a large part of the time. So it affected not only cities, but it affected the bottom line for farmers in that area. So about $4.5 billion worth of lost crops, and that's just in corn alone. And there are small cities there that still have not recovered from, and that was just last year's one. Hurricanes, we've all experienced or had friends that experienced some of the hurricanes. Predictions many years back said that as the ocean temperatures increase, the severity of hurricanes will increase. So that prediction has come to pass. And not just in the U.S. Or even just the Western Hemisphere. The typhoons in the Philippines over the years and in other areas, including Japan, are also more severe. On another front, we know that global warming is contributing to the loss of ice. If that ice is in the form of icebergs, then when it melts, it does not raise sea level. But if you have ice that's parked on land, glaciers, then as they melt, then that's what raises sea level. Additionally, the loss of the weight of that ice actually causes the land to rise. So that then can affect our predictions of sea level rise. But if you look at things like Glacier National Park, what we see is a loss in the number of glaciers. So just looking at a before and after scene, a typical scene on the left, that's a great view of some wonderful glaciers, and look at it now on the right. So look at how thick that ice was, and now it's just utterly gone. So this is documentation of real events that are occurring now. These are changes that are underway. And the predictions of things like sea level rise due to, for example, the loss of glacial ice in Greenland and Antarctica, we're actually revising those predictions. They're finding there are mechanisms they did not know occurred. So they're finding that the loss of ice is actually accelerating because it's melting underneath. Not all that melting is on the surface. Some of it is deep, and that increases the rate of the movement of the ice, and the more likely that the ice is to have new icebergs as that loss accelerates. So as sea level continues to rise, this is an actual measurement of about 3 inches rise since 1993 as of 2018. And in the U.S. alone, 40% of the population lives in a coastal area. So I know this is a tiny picture, but if you can see all the red around all the coastlines, that's the areas that are at risk. Some of the risks associated with that are not just submersion of the land, it's erosion of the coastlines. It's also the uplift of saline water, seawater, into the water table. And once your water table is no longer fresh water, if it's salt water, then of course that's not potable water anymore. So the issues go way beyond just, I need to move further inland. Some issues that may not be as obvious, and I don't want to get bogged down in the chemistry of it, but it's well known that carbon dioxide, when it dissolves in the water, forms an acid called carbonic acid. Does this in your bloodstream as well? Take my class sometime. Oh no, can't do that. So, but I can explain the chemistry later if you want. But it makes seawater more acid. And this is, again, something we've been able to measure. The increased acidity, the drop in the pH of ocean water is a measurable thing. Well, as seawater becomes more acidic, then that inhibits the ability of marine animals that form shells to form their shells. Acid dissolves the calcium carbonate in an eggshell or a clam shell or in these larval shells or in these tiny plankton and diatoms and the life forms that are microscopically small but form a shell. And if they cannot form their shells, then their population is dropping. And this is the basis of the food chain in the ocean. You have plankton, which are photosynthetic, they're little algae, and then you have other plankton that are animal-like, they're zooplankton, they eat the algae, and that's the basis of the food chain for just about the entire ocean. So as the ocean becomes more acidified, then the ability of these marine life forms to propagate, to grow to adulthood, becomes limited. And we're seeing population declines already. Another aspect of that, and this goes back to temperature, is coral bleaching. Have you heard of coral bleaching? So coral bleaching was a puzzle for a long time. We knew it was happening. It's been happening in the Florida Keys, for example. It's where people notice it. Coral bleaching occurs. This is what bleached coral looks like. You notice there's no fish here. There's no other life forms here, and the coral has basically no color. It's bleached out. So coral has color because it has symbiotic organisms that live with it. These are little colorful algae that photosynthesize and feed the coral. Except what we found is bleaching occurs when the temperature rises. And you don't need much of an increase in temperature. A very small increase in temperature was sufficient to cause the algae to be stressed, or excuse me, to cause the coral to be stressed. And when they're stressed, they just eject their little partners, their photosynthetic algae. And if they survive, that is, if the temperature drops back down, then they can reincorporate those algae. They can just kind of suck them back in and go recover. But if they stay stressed too long, that is, if the temperature stays elevated for too long, then that bleaching is permanent, that coral is dead. So that's another issue associated with what's happening in the water. At a global scale, we know that the temperature worldwide, we've just seen more extremes. What have the winters been like in New England lately? They're cold, deep snow, just paralyzing weather. And yeah, they're used to it, but not like that. Not so extreme and not for such a long period of time. So the changes to the jet stream are complicated, but it's worth talking through it. So in our two diagrams on the left, what you're seeing when there's a strong jet stream, there's a stable polar vortex. That air up at the North Pole is very, very cold, and that cold air becomes contained by that strong jet stream. And because it stays up there around the poles, yes, the pole is bitterly cold, but below the pole, below the polar vortex, temperature is what we would consider normal. Sort of cold in the winter, warm in the summer, but not crazy cold or crazy warm. On the lower diagram on the right, you see what happens is that that polar vortex becomes destabilized. There are a number of reasons that contribute to this, and we'll talk more about those reasons later. But as it becomes destabilized, the cold air can move further south in some locations, but that means that warm air intrudes further north than others. So where you see it warm, you're seeing warm. I don't see my arrow, apparently not. So where you see warm is the Pacific Northwest, where we have droughts, and where you see it cold, it's cold winters, and the same in Europe. So we've had heat waves in Europe that are severe enough to actually kill people from the heat. And all of these things contribute to what we call anthropogenic climate change. Climate is changing. And if you want to argue, well, it's not really global warming because it's so cold in New England, then you're missing a big picture. So you have to look at it on a global scale. Okay, so that's where we are now. And next, we want to talk about what happened that got us to this point. And so I want to list the root causes of global warming. These are physical attributes. They've been explained. They were first explained in published literature at least 150 years ago. We knew about greenhouse gases. We knew that if you increase the concentration of these gases into the atmosphere, that they have an effect of holding in heat. And if you want more information about that, we can do that during the Q&A, but I want to focus on what those greenhouse gases are and how much of an effect they have. And certainly water vapor is on the list. And we know that water vapor increases at a warmer temperature, right? Water evaporates, it gets out in the atmosphere, and we also know that when it's cloudy, that helps retain heat. Clouds are like a blanket, and they help retain heat. That's why it's always bitter cold on clear nights and not so cold on cloudy nights. That's the effect of water vapor. The thing about water vapor, though, is there's a maximum. There's an amount beyond which it won't stay in the air. It will precipitate out. So water vapor has a very short residence time in the atmosphere. Yes, it evaporates. Yes, it holds heat, but then it rains out, and so it continues to cycle. It doesn't stay parked in the atmosphere. Second on our list is carbon dioxide. And we know that carbon dioxide has less of a warming effect than water vapor. But we also know that carbon dioxide persists in the atmosphere for a long time. Once it's in the atmosphere, there are no natural mechanisms sufficient to remove it. There's no checks and balances on the amount of carbon dioxide the way there is for water vapor. Third on our list is methane. We know methane is natural gas. We know it comes from natural sources such as cows, ants. Y'all knew that ants emit methane, but they do swamp gas, right? So decomposition tends to release methane. But one of the problems that we've newly identified with methane is that now that we're relying more on natural gas, we have to worry about that natural gas of those pipelines or those facilities leaking into the atmosphere. And natural gas is colorless and odorless, and so it can leak and you don't know it. So there have been several incidences lately of people noticing that there were methane leaks at facilities that went on for a long time before anybody caught them. It does have more potential to raise the temperature than carbon dioxide does, but methane is an organic. That is, it's a chemical that can be metabolized by living organisms, and so it doesn't tend to last in the atmosphere as long as CO2 does. And then on the last one, there's some nitrogen gases and fluorine gases. Fluorine gases are usually associated with refrigerants like Freon. And the fluorine gases are complicated because there's actually an optimistic outlook on the fluorine gases. And yet, lately we found that there's new evidence that those chlorofluorocarbons, those fluorine gases, the jet stream is changing the way it is. All right, so those are the main ones, but we're going to discount water vapor, first of all because it's natural, second of all because it precipitates out. So when we look at the greenhouse gas emissions, first of all, you can see how much of it is CO2. So remember what I said about CO2. It doesn't have individually that much of an impact as compared to water vapor or methane, but once it gets in the atmosphere, it has a tendency to stay there. And when you look at the percentage of the emissions that are CO2, you see that huge blue area, CO2 from fossil fuels. CO2 from land use, very often that's from deforestation. So when they cut down the trees to plant soybeans or palm oil plantations or whatever, they burn those trees. And that just releases the CO2 right back into the atmosphere. CO2 from chemicals, concrete manufacturers notorious for releasing CO2, and they're actually looking at new ways to make concrete that not only reduces the release of CO2, but perhaps even can trap CO2 and then use it as a way to get CO2 out of the environment. And then we have methane, and then the nitrogen gas and the fluorine gases. So the fluorine gases are that tiny little gray sliver up there. So in terms of the percentage of the problem that's due to the fluorine gases, when I first started making this presentation, I was like, well, that's not even worth worrying about. And then I read about the outsized impact it has on the polar vortex and thought, yeah, we should probably still talk about it. Okay, so where are the problems coming from? That is, where are all these greenhouse gases being emitted from? And so you see the source of the greenhouse gas emissions, electricity, absolutely. Food and land use, again, you're burning trees, or you're turning over vegetative matter, and every time it decomposes, it releases CO2. That includes things like growing cattle. There seems to be a growing sense that eating meat is a problem in terms of CO2 emissions, CO2 and methane emissions in cattle. But if you look at the percentage of that piece of the pie that's due to cattle, it's not that high. And again, there are complications there. So if you want to talk about that at the end, that's an area we can discuss. Transportation, that's going to be gasoline-powered or diesel-powered engines, and then industry uses, and then buildings, and then there's other things. So those are the sources, and obviously the generation of fuel for powering our industry is the biggest problem. So if we look at how that's changed, we're just looking at it from the 60s. What we're seeing is that the emission of CO2 from fossil fuels is still increasing. The percentages, the light blue is gas, the sort of golden color is oil, and then black is coal. In spite of the fact that, at least in the US, we're less reliant on coal than we are on gas, we're still seeing a high proportion of our CO2 emissions still based on the use of coal. So those are the big three, though: gas, oil, and coal. Now, when we look at why CO2 is a problem, this is a graph that I think explains the correlation between temperature and CO2. So let me explain the graph first. We're starting in 1880 and we're going to the year about 2010 or so. The blue and the yellow indicate, or excuse me, the blue and the red indicate changes in temperature compared to the standards that they picked. And the standard they picked was in about 1955. And the reason they picked 55 or so is that's when they started directly measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Before that, they had no direct measure of CO2. Those CO2 concentrations are based on indirect evidence from things like drilling into the ice cores in Greenland and capturing tiny amounts of air bubbles that got trapped in that ice and measuring the amount of CO2. So blue means the temperature was lower than that year, 1955. And red causes of global warming that have been proposed. And we can discount every one of them. Is it solar input? No, it's not. Because in solar input, the projections of solar input is that actually we should be cooling. So how many of you remember in the 70s when we were worried about global cooling? Yeah. Well, there was a reason for that. And the reason was the projections from those scientists that study the effect of solar input was we're entering a period where solar input is decreasing, and we predicted that there would be actually climate cooling. That was the prediction at the time. There was another factor there, and that was pollution. How polluted was our air in the 70s? I remember visiting my sister in Los Angeles, and she said, I know you can't see it, but there's a mountain right there. The smog was so bad you literally couldn't see the horizon. So that's one of our good stories. We've actually cleaned up the air. But that particulate matter that used to fill our air actually reduced the amount of solar input. And so, yes, we were in a period of cooling. And yet, when we measure the temperature, there's no question that the temperature is increasing. And when we look for other correlating factors, we don't find anything that correlates as neatly with the temperature rise as does the CO2. Look at where that CO2 goes. We find, as I said earlier, it persists in the atmosphere for a very long period of time. So about 45% of that CO2 that's emitted is actually just going to stay trapped in the atmosphere. We have sinks. A sink is something that absorbs the CO2 and hangs onto it. Land-based sinks would be, like trees, when we plant trees and those trees grow. Those trees incorporate CO2 into their wood. So as long as you grow the trees and keep the trees and don't cut them down or burn them or let them decompose, they become a sink. They're a carbon sink. So one of the initiatives that's going on right now is let's plant more trees. Let's plant more trees. And if you tried to calculate how many trees you'd have to plant to overcome the CO2 emissions that are still rising, timber, it becomes untenable. And by the way, it's not just trees. Prairies are a good carbon sink as well. Prairie grasses may not grow that tall, but their roots are really deep. So the roots are going to be like 3 times as deep as the grass is tall. And those roots are organic material as well. They're incorporating the carbon dioxide as well. So if we get too carried away with a push towards let's plant trees, then we lose sight of the fact that trees may not be the ideal ecosystem for a particular area. So let's not plow under our prairies and try to grow trees. There are reasons that prairies are found where they are, and trees are not necessarily the best option. Our third area is the ocean basin. And this is something that, again, our predictions were not sufficient. So there was a period where the evidence looked like there was a pause in global warming. Any of y'all remember hearing about a pause in global warming? Well, first of all, it turned out there really wasn't a pause. And second of all, that CO2 was going into the ocean. A lot of it was. I mean, when you think about how vast our oceans are, it's hard to overestimate the impact that that water has. But remember what happens when the ocean absorbs CO2. What happens to the acidity of it? Acidity goes up, and that suppresses the growth and development of the marine ecosystems that are providing, just the base of the food chain, but also providing oxygen and absorbing CO2. Okay, so moving to a different subject, we're talking about what our responses have been, and some of our responses have been governmental. So this is a short list. The booklet has a longer list. It's a great list. It's kind of a depressing list when you look at it. So starting in 1992 with the Rio Summit, governmental and non-governmental organizations came together, and they tried to come to some agreement on what's our response going to be. And the agreements were few and far between. So according to your booklet, the aim was to prevent dangerous interference in the climate system. It was not legally binding to the signatories, and while 197 countries have ratified that treaty, still it's non-binding. So basically it said, we need to worry about this. So y'all do something. So we've had several since then. The Kyoto Protocol tried to put real limits on what countries would do and give real goals. The United States never signed on to the Kyoto Protocol. There have been others between them. I don't mean to imply that there was nothing between 1997 and 2016, but just jumping to more recent times, the Paris Agreement was ratified and went into effect, I think, 3 months before our last presidential election. And as we all know, our current president immediately announced we're going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. That agreement included some specific caps, limits, and limits to the amount of global warming that different countries would permit, and encouraged everybody to develop technological fixes that would help address the issue. The most recent one was the COP is a group, it's the committee of participants that's sponsored by the UN, and there have been COPs about every year for the past at least 10 years. The one in Madrid was most notable to many people because Greta Thunberg was there and presenting her point of view, which is we all have sold our future down the river to make a profit today, and we need to do something. And we're hearing more about global activism from young people, but the actual COP in Madrid came to no accords, no agreements, no major agreements were made. So they have one scheduled for next November 2020. They're hoping to get some concrete responses, but we just have to wait and see. So you can see what we've done is talk about it a lot, and what's actually been done, and what's concretely been done is very little. So that leaves us now with, we've known since at least the 1990s that we need to be doing something, and yet, as of yet, no major global agreements have significantly altered the situation that we're in now. So seeing what's possible, I've tried to divide this up into some different aspects. And of course, one of the biggest problems is just acknowledging that this is a problem. There are still people who will say global warming is not real. There are other people who will say, yeah, it's real, but it's not us. We didn't cause it, it's natural. And others that will say, oh, it's real, but it's not a problem. And then some people will actually say, well, in fact, it's quite good for us. This is a good thing. So in Australia, remember where all the fires are? One of the recent major headlines in the paper was, climate change is a good thing. And I couldn't bring myself to read the article to see what they were saying that made it a good thing. But so being able to communicate climate science is, it's a funny thing. When you talk to people, you think, if I could just convince you of the facts, then surely you would understand and take action. And what we find, of course, is we've been communicating these facts since at least the 90s, and in fact, probably at least 20 years before that. Climate scientists have been doing their jobs. They've been telling people, if this goes on, here are predictions. And they've been discounted and vilified and terrorized online or whatever. So communicating climate science in and of itself is not sufficient. It's just not in human nature for us to accept that. So what we found is that talking to people in terms of not just, you're an idiot if you don't buy climate science, that doesn't work with anybody. But what I'm trying to say to people is, imagine the world your children and grandchildren are going to inherit. And think about what you could be doing today that would make that a better world. And that tends to resonate with people more than just, hey, here's what the science says. So along with that is identifying some of the misconceptions. And these just keep multiplying somehow. You know there are people who have decided the earth is flat, right? You know the flat earthers. So when you compare that to what we're trying to deal with in terms of climate science, you can see people just have these mindsets that it's really difficult to counteract. So finding what they believe or to act the way they act becomes crucial in determining, what's the best way to convince this person. So when you realize that a lot of the major money going into climate denial or any of those issues of just putting it off, not dealing with it. You see a lot of them are funded by the fossil fuel industry. And certainly they have a vested interest in making a profit, but their methods are potentially suspect. So for example, in Washington State in the last election, they had, I think it was a carbon tax they were trying to pass. And people were motivated and they were energized and they really thought they had it, and it didn't pass. Did not pass. And when they realized how much money the Washington State energy providers had put into just doubt, just casting doubt. This might work, but it's probably not the best way. It's not well thought out. There are problems we need to discuss. Let's just put it off. And so that idea, that's basically what happened in Madrid, is we don't know enough yet to make these kinds of decisions, to take these kinds of actions. And so finding ways to deal with that is very difficult. And then finding pragmatic solutions, hey, it's not that easy. Can you plant 1 trillion trees? Can you do that? Probably not 1 trillion. Is that pragmatic? It's not going to work everywhere. And you have to deal with the realities that people have to make a living. So you can't just go into a place and just plant trees and move the people out. That simply is not going to, that's not pragmatic. So trying to find those solutions that will actually make a difference, that they are workable and they don't crash the economy, those are all issues that we have to deal with pragmatic solutions. So when we look at these in categories, the political solutions, these are a couple of things that are out there right now. They're being either enacted or they're close to being enacted. So in Europe, they have a proposal for a Green Deal, a European Green Deal. And if you read the aim, it is a resource-efficient and competitive economy that will generate jobs, purify the air, and mobilize industry, agriculture, and other sections to get to net zero. Sounds noble, doesn't it? In my opinion, it's at this point a little short on details, but you have to have something you're aiming for. And at least they're announcing, hey, we're really going to go after net zero emissions. In Germany, I just read this morning, The German economy is very much coal-based. They have their own coal reserves. Their industries are very coal-heavy. And they have already announced that they will be zero coal, that they're going to be able to generate energy without coal. So I'm just thinking if they can do that, that makes it a pragmatic solution. It can be done. The plan in Costa Rica is to decarbonize by 2050. In Costa Rica, it's very easy to expand their forest. It's a tropical country with lots of rainforest. They have a very heavy tourist-based economy. So a lot of that land is already in national parks. All they need to do is acquire, some little private out pockets and put them back in the forest, and they can still generate income from tourism. So I think in Costa Rica, it's not a unique environment, but it's certainly not our environment. So there are some plans, of course, in the U.S. to go to the Green New Deal, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. Business solutions. More and more businesses are finding that they need to at least sound like they're worried about the climate. And so we have this whole alliance, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. This is an investing group. It just started in September, and they already have $4 trillion invested after 2 months. People are looking to put their money into those investment opportunities that help fight climate change. So people are putting their money where their mouth is, and so many companies recognize the need to jump onto that idea of we need to be climate friendly. Optimism is probably the most important thing. If you stop and think about the fires in Australia and the extinction of entire groups of animals there, the loss of the forests in the Pacific Northwest that will not grow back in our lifetime, it's easy to get really depressed. But if you don't move from that to a point of view of, this is where we are today, and we have to move on. We have to find a way to move on. Then if you lose that optimism, then it's very easy to fall into the trap of just letting the fossil fuel industries do what they want. We're all going to die anyway. We might as well make some money before we go. That's kind of the mindset of some people. And I try really hard to fight that. So I want to talk briefly about successes. So we already talked about the fact that in the 70s we had significant problems with air pollution. We had rivers on fire from all of the pollutants in them. We had entire forests dying from acid precipitation. And we enacted changes to our industry standards to require scrubbers in those big smokestacks. And that removed not only the air pollution, but the acid. Our forests came back. Our air is clear. Our water is clear. These are all successes just since the 70s. And that's phenomenal when you think of it. We had another issue with the ozone layer. Are you familiar with ozone hole? So they identified that the cause of the growing ozone hole over the South Pole was those chlorofluorocarbons, those things that are in Freon that we use for refrigerants. And they started banning them. And you know what? Within a decade, the ozone hole grew back. Not completely, but it just shows you that when we identify a problem and we come up with a pragmatic solution and actually enact it, we can, in fact, affect change on a global scale. It can be done. It has been done. We've done it recently. All we need is the willpower. The technology is available or can be developed. And when you think about how fast, how long ago did Al Gore invent the internet? How long ago? I mean, I know I had an email address longer than 10 years ago, but I had my first little flip phone in 2010. And when you think about that in terms of where we are today and the rapid changes in technology, I think we still have a stack of cassette tapes. We never went with the 8-track because we couldn't decide if Sony or Beta was going to win. I am so glad I'm talking to an audience that knows what I'm doing. If I tried to talk to my college students about that. But you understand what I'm saying. Technology does occasionally change rapidly. It doesn't cause the economy to crash. We find ways to succeed with these technological changes, even at the scale that we've seen. And so I think this can be done. We just need the willpower and the resources to do it. So I just got this in the mail this morning, SWEPCO. All right, so let's take a look at where we are today. We've got this big purple reliance on coal, a little bit of natural gas and wind, and then where they hope to be in 2038. It's still almost half coal. So is that good enough for us? You know, it doesn't meet the objectives of being carbon neutral by 2050. I mean, it's just, that's what they're projecting themselves as being climate friendly. We recognize this problem, here's our goal. And it's up to us to recognize, you know what? We need to boost the solar and the wind. When you look at this, not just the size of Texas, but the location of Texas, I think we're the most wind, we generate the most wind of any state in the U.S. Now that's an unfair comparison because it's such a big state. But still, it can be done, it can be expanded. And we can certainly do a lot more with solar. I was in China in 2004. The cities there are huge. We went to some minor cities. They only had about 13 million inhabitants, small cities. But as I looked out the hotel window from this high-rise hotel, every rooftop, solar collectors, all of them. Now when I went to Beijing, the air was very dirty. I mean, it was really hard to breathe because they still, in the small holdings, they're still coal-fired. So I met individuals who were still cooking over a coal fire, cooking their rice over a coal fire. So obviously there's a wide range of responses in a country as complicated as China, but their reliance on solar puts us to shame. And we could certainly be doing a lot more along those lines. So I'm happy that SWEPCO is like saying we want to be climate responsible, but I'm just going to say I think, in my opinion, that their goals should be a little bit more aggressive. Okay, so a lot of people would like to say, you know what, we're going to have a technological fix. Somebody's going to invent something that's just going to yank all that CO2 out of the air, and this problem's just going to solve itself. They're going to come up with some technological thing. So we already talked about the fact that you really cannot plant enough trees to absorb all the carbon that, remember, it's increasing the amount of carbon that's being emitted. But we do have some technological innovations on the horizon. I think the problem for most people is they don't realize the scale of the problem. How much CO2 is being pumped into the atmosphere versus how much can be sucked out by these things. I mean, it's just like, it's swampy. The amount of CO2 that can be removed is nowhere near the amount that's being emitted. So if we don't reduce emissions, then these fixes are not going to reduce the total amount of CO2. And we're going to continue to see global warming. I talked about reformulating concrete. They're working on ways to make concrete that actually suck up CO2 rather than releasing it. And my favorite is the living concrete. Any of y'all hear about that? Living concrete. So it's a mix of inorganic stuff like sand and this gel, and they inject this gel with algae. So it's green, and it photosynthesizes. And the cool thing to me about it was if it cracks, it can heal itself. So I don't know how useful it's going to be in trying to grow concrete from scratch, but you know, it's something very new. Who thought of that? That's thinking outside the box to me. So yes, there will be technological fixes. My concern is it's hard to realize this is here over the last 100 years. The amount we're still emitting and the small scale of these technological fixes is simply not going to solve the problem. So what about personal action? There are a lot of people who are saying, well, if you're not doing something personally, you have no right to complain. And I would say, you know, that's not the case, and yet, are there things you could be doing? And there are a lot of people who focus on this because they just feel powerless in dealing with fossil fuel companies or CO2 release or government decisions. And there are people who are making all these choices. What I want you to notice is the choice number one, 58.6, tons of CO2 equivalent per year have no children, have one fewer child. It's a little late for us in this room, right? I mean, I shouldn't say it. But there are young people today who will say, I am not having children. I am not contributing to this problem. And for them, that's a real choice. And it's an effective choice. There are going to be ramifications down the line. So not to spend too much time on it, but when China enacted the one-child policy and said you can only have one child, the impact on their culture, their economy, and their future was beyond what they figured. I mean, they simply didn't incorporate enough about what impact that was going to have. And I would say the same about any efforts to rein in population growth. It's too complicated to mandate. But if you're making a personal choice, I'm absolutely fine with that. Okay, so if it's too late for you to not have any more kids, living car-free, how old does that work in the U.S.? If you go to Europe, you know, people live in compact cities or villages surrounded by farm fields and forests. And in a lot of parts, in China, they have the high-speed rail. In Japan, they have high-speed rail. We simply haven't developed that infrastructure yet. And so it's just a matter, again, of making decisions about, is this something we want? And in Texas, I'm sure you know, the issue is that's my land and I'm not. You can't take over it. So when they tried to put that high-speed rail line in along I-35, they got a lot of kickback from the landowners, personal property rights. So it is very complex. The third one, the blue one up there, avoid one round-trip transatlantic flight. How many of us in this room is that going to affect? A transatlantic flight. Wasn't planning on one anytime soon, so I can do my part by not. All right, let's get to some more serious things. By green energy, does that change things? Did you get to pick your energy provider? Can you choose, I want only renewable energy? Does that change the amount of energy being generated by coal in your area? I mean, you're buying it from the grid. All that energy feeds into the grid. I would suspect that if enough people did, that might have an impact, but I would say probably the jury's out on that, at least in terms of where we live. Buying a more efficient car, absolutely. Switch from electric cars to free, again, that's kind of problematic for us. Eat a plant-based diet. So if I give up beef, how much of an impact am I going to have? That's the green one, about halfway down. 0.8 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, less than a ton. That's still a significant amount. So, you know, I'll tell you that we personally, like me, have trouble giving it up, but we have reduced. You know, at least we've reduced the portion size of meat that we eat. Wash your clothes in cold water, recycle, hang dry your clothes, upgrade your light bulbs. All these are minor. Does that mean they're not effective? If enough people did them, it probably would help. And you know, we have Energy Star appliances now. It's kind of hard to buy anything that isn't. But if we didn't have the availability of these new light bulbs, we had the complex fluorescents and now we have the LEDs. Where did those come from? Why are they in our stores now? Didn't we have a government mandate? And our current president has just relaxed that mandate. So we'll see what effect that has. Okay, so I hope I haven't compounded your sense of dismay over climate change. I am happy to take questions. I thought of two, but these are mine. What about climate refugees? We already have climate refugees. How are we going to deal with those globally? And how are our responses going to interact with all those other factors? Those social factors, cultural factors, political issues. How are all those going to interact? Because it's a very complex issue. And it's very easy to say we don't have enough answers to make a decision. But making no decision is still making a decision. You're opting not to act. And the cost of that has yet to be calculated. So if we say, oh, we can't do that because it will cost these many trillions of dollars, the flip question is, how much is it going to cost not to do anything? So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I would love to entertain questions. How much time do we have? Oh, not as much as I hoped.
Well, you didn't mention that prediction for new diseases, and we've got one with China.
Yeah, I hated to get into that. So, yeah, so as the temperature warms and as the populations expand, not only are more viral, particularly viral, but also bacterial and fungal, not only are they more viable, but as we expand into those areas, we're more likely to come in contact with them, which is probably how we came in contact with Ebola, for example. So great question, but it's too much for today. Yes, sir.
I just want to make a comment about Germany and their coal plants.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they have done that. I'm a grow trees member of Texas Forest Association, and they keep telling the U.S. southern forests are selling tons of wood pellets to Germany to
really?
burn in place of the coal,
Yeah.
and they're calling it renewable energy. To me, that's a little deceptive.
Yeah, that's a little sleight of hand, don't you think? So are trees renewable? Sure. What's the crop duration of southern forest? 50 years at least. So yeah, if your crop takes 50 years to mature, I would not consider that renewable.
It's
or
a
sustainable.
booming business for forest people.
Yeah. So yeah, that's problematic. What are the Germans using instead? And of course, in France, they rely mostly on nuclear power, and that has issues of its own. So sure, it's carbon neutral, but there's so what happened in Japan. Yes, sir.
Well, what are these issues with nuclear energy that
What-
are so that we cannot even consider that as part of the solution?
In my understanding of nuclear energy, the main problem to me is the cost and the timeline. How long does it take and how much does it cost to get a new nuclear reactor online? But until we have a way to deal with that radioactive waste, I mean, after what happened in Fukushima in Japan, I think that caused people to kind of think twice about nuclear.
Building an earthquake zone.
Well, that's a good first start. Don't put a nuclear reactor in an earthquake zone. But beyond that, there is new technology now that is saying we don't have to have spent nuclear fuel. We can recycle it. We can reuse it. And so if that happens, I think a lot of people's issues would probably subside. But for now, the issue mostly is what do we do with all that radioactive waste?
There was something in the workbook that talked about that new technology for the nuclear reactors in the area.
Yeah. Yeah, so that would be a technological solution that would help tremendously. But I think too many people have reasonable reservations. Chernobyl comes to mind, Okay, so yeah. Yes, sir.
Me?
Mhm.
This is a very contentious, controversial subject that we had up on the wall. President Trump addressed that, and he poo-pooed climate change, called it everything from an urban legend to an old life stage.
Chinese hoax, she had said.
I myself have tried to keep an open mind on the subject. I'm not an expert on this subject, but I've learned enough that ever since the Earth cooled down from a molten rock, there have been periodic ice ages.
That's very true. But the same people that taught us that are using the same methodologies, the same science to make these current predictions. So if you accept the past, the changes in the past, then why would you reject using the same science, the same scientists, and the same thought processes to say what's happening today? It's not a matter of degree, it's a matter of how fast it's occurring. Because this has only been happening since basically the Industrial Revolution.
Well, my question was,
Yeah, we'll take one more question.
I have a question. You were talking about the rate that the oceans are becoming more acidic. Is that the rate that's happening around the globe? Is it the same percentage-wise everywhere, or are there like hot spots where it's occurring?
I would have to suspect ocean currents are going to have an impact on that. Just wherever the mixture of air and water, where it's more turbulent, and then where those currents are going to take that water. Absolutely, that's going to have an effect. Sure. Let's do it.
Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Dr. Allen. wonderful presentation, and I will remind you that we meet again next Wednesday at 12 o'clock, right in the same place. And our subject for next week is modern slavery and human trafficking. Dr. David Scott will be leading the presentation, and he is a professor who at one time was a policeman. So he should be quite knowledgeable on this subject of human slavery, so modern slavery and human trafficking. So come back next week. Thank you.